All right. Hebrews chapter 9. And we got down to about verse 18. So we'll go back to 16, which kind of is the beginning of the paragraph. For where there is a testament, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament is enforced after men are dead, since it has no power at all while the testator lives. And we mentioned last week that this is similar to having a will. The will does not go into effect until after the person passes. And up to that time, up until the person passes, they can change the will. They have power to do that. No one else does, but they do. But once the person has passed, then that will, that testament, that covenant is set. No one can change it. And so, at the death of Jesus, then that new covenant, the new will, the New Testament, went into effect, and no one can change any part of it. No one has the power to do that. So he said, therefore, not even the first covenant was dedicated without blood. The first testament, the first covenant, what we call the law of Moses, there was blood everywhere in that covenant. I mean, there was blood offered every day, many, many times. There was various blood sacrifices needed for trespass offerings, or trespasses and sins and transgressions, and all of these things required various blood sacrifices. And then, of course, the high priest on the Day of Atonement sprinkled blood. Remember about that? Sprinkled it on the altar. So there was the first testament, the first covenant, just had blood, like I said, everywhere on it. Blood was everywhere in that testament, and it was a reminder. It was a reminder of the cost of sin, because those sacrifices were about sin. So each of those revolved around the fact that an animal of some kind had to give up its life, and it wasn't voluntary. Those animals didn't volunteer to give up their life, to sacrifice their life. It was something that was done to them. In other words, their life was taken from them, and it wasn't voluntary in any way. So, you know, a lot of people, and I even hear today, and people talk today about the fact, well, why did Jesus have to shed His blood? That just seems so archaic and old-fashioned for blood have to be shed. You know, they think that whole concept of the shedding of blood was just so outdated. But as we see in this chapter, it was a necessity. Jesus would not have shed His blood if it hadn't been a necessity. And of course that's what he's going to talk about in really the rest of this chapter, was how necessary the shedding of blood was. For when Moses had spoken every precept to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of calves and goats with water, scarlet wool, and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant which God has commanded you." Then likewise he sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry. And according to the law, almost all things are purified with blood, and without shedding of blood there is no remission. There is no remission whatsoever. Here he talks about what had to be done from Moses all the way down. What had to be done with blood. And this is found in Exodus. Parts of this are in Exodus, parts in Leviticus, parts in Numbers, about all the different things that were done. The sprinkling of blood. And when he talks about water here, you know, you go back and water was always mixed with something. Remember, sometimes it was mixed with the ashes of a heifer, and there were various things that were mixed with water. I think it would be rare, if ever, that just pure water was used. It was always mixed with something. It was always mixed with something. And so here he says, he talks about the blood of calves and goats with water, scarlet wool, and hyssop. And he says, all of that was mixed and sprinkled, he says, both the book itself and all the people. This, of course, was a sanctifying effect. It was a sanctifying effect. And he says, this is the blood of the covenant which God has commanded you. Again, blood. You know, the Bible says that the life is in the blood. We can't exist without blood today. Animals can't exist without blood. I mean, you take the blood away, you take the life away. And so blood was of the essence. It was absolutely essential in these sacrifices because it showed that life leaving. That animal, whether it was a bull or goat, whatever, bird, you know, sometimes there were birds sacrificed. It showed that that animal had to give up its life for that trespass, for that sin, for that transgression. Something had to die. And so that's why this idea of blood is so critical, not just with the Old Covenant, but with the New that he's going to mention here in a minute. So it was absolutely essential. He says he sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and all the vessels. Okay, all of that was done because everything essentially was defiled. So Moses had to take this blood and sprinkle it on there, essentially to purify it, so that it could be sanctified and used for God's purposes. So that's why he had to sprinkle the tabernacle, all the tabernacle itself, and then everything used in the tabernacle. And I think I mentioned already that he doesn't talk about the temple, because remember at this time, all of that stuff was gone. They didn't have anything left. All of that stuff in the most holy place especially was gone. It was just an empty room. It didn't have anything in it. So there wasn't anything for the high priest or anybody else to sprinkle in the most holy place because it was empty. But he went all the way back to the tabernacle when all of this was started. Remember, that was the beginning of all of this. That was the beginning of the holy place, the most holy place, you know, the altar and the laver and all of this stuff. That's when it began, was with the tabernacle. And then, of course, with the building of the temple in Solomon's day, and then later, then it was more permanent. But the tabernacle was something they set up for a period of time, then they took it down, moved it, set it up, on and on and on. And so it had to be purified. It had to be sanctified so these people could use it. And he says, almost all things are purified with blood. Now that's an interesting statement when he puts the word almost there. Almost everything was sanctified with blood. Remember, in some circumstances, if the person was poor enough, they could substitute, instead of a bull, a goat, a sheep, birds, whatever, they could substitute a non-animal, like a grain offering. But it's interesting when you read those verses that apparently after that person made that offering, then the priest would come along and have to offer an animal. So even with a person who you know, under dire circumstances couldn't afford a blood sacrifice, then the priest would come along after and do it for them. So in other words, there were two sacrifices that had to be made. That grain offering was made, but then the priest would have to come along and then do that himself later. The Bible over and over and over talks about without the shedding of blood there's no remission, there's no forgiveness, there's no purification, there's no cleansing. Blood was absolutely essential. Blood was essential to it. And again, that's why Jesus had to do it. So now he's getting ready to talk about how Jesus' sacrifice was essential. Now, those people had to make blood sacrifices day after day after day. And then every year on the Day of Atonement, then the big sacrifices were made by the high priest. But now he's getting ready to say that Jesus only had to do it one time. He's already mentioned that more than once, but now he's going to emphasize it again. And of course, that was Jesus' dying on the cross and shedding of his blood was a huge stumbling block to the Jews. I mean, a huge stumbling block to them. And so let's go on with verse 23. Therefore it was necessary that the copies of the things in the heavens should be purified with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. Here's the contrast again that goes throughout the book of Hebrews. Contrasting the old covenant with the new, and how the new is superior in every way. Well, here is one thing he's talking about. All of those types of things in the Old Testament, you know, the altar and the laver and the candles and all of that, those were all types. And they all had antitypes in the New Testament. And all the ones, he says, in the New Testament with the New Covenant are better than the old ones. Are better than the old ones. That's what he's saying here in verse 23. The copies of the things in the heavens should be purified with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices. Just like the holy place we talked about, the holy place in the Old Testament is represented by the church in the New. And the most holy place in the Old Testament is represented by heaven today. Because it talked about how Jesus has entered the most holy place. Of course, he entered heaven. So all of these things, the church is much greater and better than the holy place was. And of course, heaven, obviously, much, much greater than the most holy place. But all of those things, those were all types in the Old Testament, and the antitypes are always so much better in every way that you could imagine. So that's why he says the heavenly things themselves came with better sacrifices, because they came with Christ's death. And his was a better sacrifice than all of those other animals. You know, those animals, and I think I mentioned last week, there would have been millions, billions of animals during those 1600 years that were sacrificed. Because these happened practically every day. And we're talking about at least a few million people. And so when you think about how many sins, trespasses, transgressions they would have had, that they would have had to sacrifice. And so the amount of blood that was sacrificed during those 1600 years was just astronomical. Just astronomical. But Christ, the blood that he sacrificed on the cross, one time, just that amount of blood was greater in power than all of the blood sacrificed by those millions and millions of animals for 1600 years. And that's the point he's driving in the whole book of Hebrews, really, was how much greater it was. For Christ has not entered the holy places made with hands. Christ didn't go into those holy places. That's in the Old Testament. That's not where he went. He didn't go into the holy place in the temple. He didn't go into the most holy place in the temple. Those are not the ones he went to. He says those are copies of the truth. They're copies of the truth. And just think about today. Copies are not very valuable. They're not very valuable. I've seen some great imitations, copies that people's made of, Da Vinci or Rembrandt or whoever. They made copies, but those are pretty worthless compared to the originals. And that's what he's saying right here. He says those copies, those things in the Old Covenant have very little value compared to the New. He says they're just copies. That's all they are. They're copies. Remember other place he said that they were a shadow. And of course a shadow has no substance. Right? They're just copies of the true. So Christ didn't enter the holy place and then the most holy place in the temple or the tabernacle. He entered, he says, heaven itself. See, that's something that the priest and the high priest, they weren't able to do that. They weren't able to access heaven. They didn't physically in any way do that. But he says that's what Christ did. He entered heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God. And then that last phrase is so important, for us. So Jesus, when He entered the most holy place, heaven, He's there for us in God's presence. Remember, we've already talked about Him being a mediator and our high priest and the fact that He makes intercession for us. So He is in heaven for us. And that's exactly what He's doing. He's there for us. Not that He should offer Himself often, verse 25, as the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood of another. Well, he said that again, and now He's saying it in another way to emphasize the fact that the high priest every year on the Day of Atonement had to do the same thing. Had to do the same thing. He would offer a bull, he would offer blood, he would take it into the most holy place, and he would, remember there would be two goats, and one would be killed, the other would send into the wilderness as the scapegoat. And so the high priest every year had all these various sacrifices and rituals to do. And he had to do the exact same thing every year, over and over and over again, because it was never good enough. It was never sufficient to completely purify and cleanse someone of sin. There was that constant reminder every 365 days of sin. The guilt of sin. See, he said the guilt never went away. The guilt never went away. So that's why the high priest every single year would go in, and notice he says every year with the blood of another. The high priest didn't take his own blood into the most holy place. It was the blood of something else. It was the blood of something else. It was never his own blood. But he said, he then would have had to suffer often since the foundation of the world, but now, once at the end of the ages, He has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of Himself. Jesus did not have to make more than one sacrifice. He didn't have to, like the high priest in the old days, go in once a year and do this. One time, he says. That was it. One time. That's all He's had to do. And that was sufficient, he says, to put away sin. Because unlike the high priest didn't take his own blood. Jesus took His own blood into the most holy place. And that made all the difference, he says. Jesus took His own blood, and that made the difference. No high priest in the Old Testament ever took his own blood into the most holy place. It was the blood of an animal. Wasn't sufficient. So he says, it is appointed for men to die once, and after this the judgment. Now he just talked about the fact that Jesus only had to die one time. That's what he's been stressing here. Jesus didn't have to do this every year, every 10 years, every 100 years. One time was it. And so now he's making that same example to the fact that men, all men, are appointed to die once. In other words, all of us, unless we're alive when Christ comes, will die one time. And then we will know our judgment. It says we will know our judgment. One time, and that's it. You know, the Bible tells us that we'll return to the dust. We'll return to the dust, Genesis chapter 3. And that's what we do. We return to the dust. We become, you know, our body decomposes. And we eventually become just like the earth from which basically Adam was made. So we return. And so we have this death that's a part of everybody's life. Now that's happy-go-lucky right there. That's what I call that. Happy-go-lucky. All right, and then he finishes, and this is where we'll finish. So Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. To those who eagerly wait for Him, He will appear a second time, apart from sin, for salvation. Jesus is coming a second time, but it will not have anything to do with a sacrifice. In other words, He did that one time. Jesus was offered once to bear the sins of many. He did that, and He fulfilled that part of God's plan of our redemption. He did it one time. But for those who eagerly wait for Him, He is coming back. You know, that's what 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 talks about. He's going to come, you know, the Bible says He's going to come in a cloud. There's going to be a great, the trumpet, as He says, is going to blow. Everybody's going to know that He's coming. There's no rapture. There's no secret coming. Everybody in the world will know that He's coming. It'll be loud. It'll be apparent. It'll be obvious. It'll be certain. But He's not coming back to do anything about sin. He did that once back in the first century, and that was it. This time, He's coming back for salvation. He's coming back, like 1 Thessalonians 4 talks about, those people who are eagerly awaiting for Him, who have prepared for His second coming. He's coming back for salvation. He says He's going to take us, and we're going to be with Him forever. And that's why 1 Thessalonians 4 ends up, I think it's verse 18, saying that these things we need to share with people to encourage them. That's what we need to do. We need to encourage people that if they prepare themselves now, then when Jesus comes, it'll be the greatest moment in our lives. So He's not coming for sin, to do anything with sin. He's coming back for salvation. And that's what He's been stressing over and over and over again, really in Hebrews chapter 7, 8, and 9, stressing Jesus is in every way better than the high priest of the Old Testament. His new covenant is in every way superior. Everything is better, superior, greater than the old. But He is coming again. And the writer here says that it's not a possibility, it's a certainty. That's why Paul wrote, 1 Thessalonians is pretty much written because those Christians in Thessalonica were worried about those Christians who had already died. And they were worried, well, what's going to happen to them? Well, Paul writes back and tells them, when Jesus comes back, we're all going to be united with Him in the air, and we'll be with Him forever. And so Paul answers their concerns. So the next chapter, we go back and he talks again about how animal sacrifices were very insufficient. And again, why Christ's death is so much greater than those sacrifices.